Hello, welcome to Critical Race Theory and the 2020 election, brought to you by the Center on Race, Sexuality, and Culture at UC Berkeley Law. I am Russell K. Robinson, professor at Berkeley Law and the faculty director of the center. You have an impressive roster of speakers today, and I'll introduce them shortly. But first, a land acknowledgement. I'd like to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Cho-Chenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekmo Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. We want to thank our sponsors, the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley and the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law. I got my start at UCLA CRS, so I'm happy to be in partnership with the CRS folks. We also want to bring your attention to a related event in mid-November. On Tuesday, November 17th, the center will present Perceptual and Emotional Segregation, the Peril and Promise of Talking Across Identity Lines in 2020. I'll be in conversation with Professor Elizabeth Emmons of Columbia Law School, and we will discuss your stories of trying to connect across identity lines and the complications that can follow from that. So please submit your stories at our center website. I'm going to ask my RAAG to put a link in the chat now so that you can go to the website and submit your stories, which we will discuss in just a few weeks. Also now, this is a good time to acknowledge the tremendous support and great appreciation for AG and for Caroline Chang, who have been completely instrumental in planning this program. I'm going to give brief introductions to our four illustrious speakers. I encourage you to consult their faculty websites for their full bios. They're all incredibly accomplished. We could spend the next hour just reading all the wonderful things that they published, but I think you want to hear us talk to each other. So first, Cheryl Harris is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Professor in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at UCLA. She's often served as the faculty director for the Critical Race Studies program and has been widely hailed for her teaching, receiving the ACLU Foundation of Southern California's Distinguished Professor Award for Civil Rights Education. Cheryl helped hire me at UCLA way back when and is a mentor and a dear friend. In fact, reading her titanic article, Whiteness as Property, was what motivated me to become a race scholar. In an alternate universe, I was going to be an IP scholar, and then I read Cheryl's work and said, I've got to try to be a race scholar. Her recent article, Intersectionality at 30, Mapping the Margins of Anti-Essentialism, Intersectionality and Dominance Theory with Devin Carbato, is another one of my faves. Ian Haney-Lopez, my colleague at Berkeley, is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law. He too is a dear friend and a brother in truth-telling. Ian is incredibly prolific. One of his earliest articles, The Social Construction of Race, powerfully reminds us that race is a fabrication, a lie created for political purposes, that nonetheless has pervasive real-world effects. I assign this article in virtually all of my classes because it can be easy to forget that race is inherently political, not natural. He's published numerous books, most recently Dog Whistle Politics, and even more recently Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America. And I'm sure he'll talk more about that book very soon. So I think Harris and Haney-Lopez are the CRT trailblazers or OGs. The next two panelists are our rising stars. Along with my colleague Asad Rahim, I consider them to be the future of CRT. So Amna Akbar is associate professor at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University. She's become a leading voice on abolishing mass incarceration. Her work harnesses the potential of social movements to transform our thinking about law enforcement and law reform. She does this brilliantly in Toward a Radical Imagination of Law, which contrasts the Obama administration's cramped vision of police reform, post-Ferguson, with the revolutionary imagination of activists in the movement for Black lives. And I think she'll talk about what we can learn from listening to activists. So this is a must read for anybody who cares about race and policing. And then finally, we have Kay-Sue Park, Associate Professor of Law at Georgetown. Kay-Sue is a junior professor, but you would never know it from listening to her. She has a commanding intelligence and the boldness to draw previously overlooked connections among immigration law, American Indian law, and Jim Crow. Her Self-Deportation Nation in the Harvard Law Review is another one of my faves. So I'm just super happy to be able to get these folks together and to talk about this really challenging moment. I pulled this group together because the last 4 years have been tumultuous and I think historic when it comes to race. I wanted to hear the best legal minds talk to each other, let these ideas percolate in terms of figuring out like what has happened, what have we survived in the last 4 years? How do we make sense of this? And what should we do going forward? So that's the hope from this conversation. I want to begin by taking us back to almost 4 years ago. And I remember this vividly. I was actually at a critical race conference when I got an alert about this this op-ed by Mark Lilla, who is a New York Times, who wrote a New York Times piece called The End of Identity Liberalism. Right? He argued that Democrats lost the presidency because Hillary Clinton, quote, called out explicitly to African-American, Latino, LGBT, and women voters at every stop. Lilla argued that the left's obsession with identity had eclipsed analysis of class. His op-ed sparked a debate as to whether Democrats should focus on firing up women and minority voters or try to recover Rust Belt whites who swung from Obama to Trump. So to our panelists, to what extent has identity politics remained central for Democrats and Republicans in the last 4 years and in the current campaign? And let's start with Ian on this.
Thank you, Russell. And thanks for a great question and even more for pulling us all together. All too rarely do we get to join together in conversation. So I'm very grateful to you for bringing us together. So listen, the idea of identity politics is an idea that emerges in the academic wars of the 1980s at a time when women and people of color, people with different sexual orientations were beginning to articulate the idea that these perspectives had been systematically excluded and that the exclusion had been normalized. And one of the ways that people in authority responded was by saying, the way we think about the world that reflects various forms of privilege does not actually reflect privilege, is instead neutral. Whereas when you try and focus our attention on hierarchies and the way in which these hierarchies shape the academy, that's not neutral. That is subjective. That is political. So they tried to insulate themselves from an active critique by saying, we're neutral, we're apolitical, we represent the universal, you all represent subjectivity, the political and the particular. That's the origins of identity politics. Mark Lilla was an activist in the sort of academic wars, and then he simply repurposed that sort of a critique to say, hey, people who talk about patriarchy and racism and homophobia and who expect the Democratic Party to respond to the interests of all Americans, including those whose lives are cabined by these hierarchies, those people are subjective and particular and divisive. But here's the truth, and this is a very, very important truth. All politics is identity politics, all the way down. It always is, it always has been, and it certainly always is right now, whether we're thinking about racial justice or gender justice movements, or whether we're thinking about centrist Dems who say, no, we're objective, we're neutral, we're focused on economic issues, we're not concerned with identity. They very much are. And certainly we can look at the Republican Party and say, that's all identity politics. What is identity politics? Or rather, what is politics in this sense? Politics, more than anything else, is people asking themselves a set of questions. Who am I in this society? Who threatens me? And who are my allies? Those are the three principal questions around almost everybody organizes their political lives. Not abstract questions about policy, not abstract questions about political theory, questions of identity. Who am I? Who threatens me? Who are my allies? And when we look at, when we parse politics using those questions, well, then look at the Republican Party. The Republican Party says, to the who am I question, they use race to answer that question. We're hardworking folks, we're innocent folks, we're the folks who built this country, we're the folks who once made this country great and want to make it great again. But underlying that answer is a racial story of whites as the founders and the appropriate inheritors of the United States. Who threatens us? The GOP, Donald Trump says illegals, terrorists, arsonists, people who threaten law and order. And that too is a racial story about supposedly dangerous and undeserving people of color. And who are our allies? The supposed job creators, the business people who, rather than supporting government programs that help the undeserving or that coddle the criminals, instead understand that they must support the marketplace, right? That's the Republican story. And the Democrats need to respond in kind. They need to articulate a compelling vision of who we are as people who see our fates are linked, as people who are threatened, not by each other, not by our neighbors, but instead by powerful elites, and that our allies are everybody who will join together, celebrate difference, build bridges across division, and fight to ensure that government works for working families rather than these powerful elites stoking division. It's always been identity politics. It's certainly identity politics now.
Cheryl, do you want to respond to anything that Ian said or say more about this idea that all politics is identity politics?
I would have to say that I agree. The pejorative affiliation of identity politics with people of color or marginalized groups that are fighting for power is really deeply ironic. I mean, even going back to your point about Lilla's op-ed, I find it really remarkable that he cast his analysis as a critique of identity politics when one could actually read what he's doing as another version of identity politics. I mean, in fact, I think what it does reflect is a failure to understand politics in intersectional terms. So if we think about what Lilla is saying, he's calling for a focus on class in lieu of race, but it's not really colorblind. He's not really talking about the working class as a whole. He's talking about it's an appeal to the white working class, which is a very specific form of identity politics. And what we've seen in the last 4 years is a consolidation of that form of political intervention around the sense of white victimization. Paradoxically, even as white nationalism has entered mainstream politics, another form of identity politics, and Trump and his enablers advocate for white interests as white, I mean, very specifically. But I guess what I'm saying is, ironically, Lilla sees himself as denouncing the very kind of politics that his intervention is practicing. And it has to do with the invisibility of whiteness under a kind of colorblind analysis. So, yeah.
There's also a coded nature of some of the terms that actually have identity underpinnings. So for instance, recently, there's been a lot of talk about suburban women, right? Mm-hmm. And talked about how he's gonna protect suburban women from an urban invasion. Can somebody kind of unpack how that's racialized and gendered and that's identity politics, but somehow circulates as neutral in Trump's mind, at least?
I'm happy to speak to that. The suburbs, of course, were a development in the American landscape that was an explicitly white supremacist project. It was a project of redlining by the FHA, which really elevated the white desire to live apart from non-whites to a national program. The suburbs did not exist as they are constituted today before that. It was not until the FHA agreed to insure banks, giving mortgage loans to people, but placed certain conditions upon that insurance, namely that the houses had to be in racially homogenous white areas. That was an explicit condition, and that's why redlining is so notorious today. Other policies of the FHA not only ensured that the suburbs would be built as racially white homogenous spaces, but also that buildings in urban centers would not be maintained. There were explicit provisions that encouraged the building of new structures rather than the maintenance of old ones, and so on and so forth, leading to the abandonment and decay of urban centers where people of color were forced to live because lack of opportunity to purchase homes elsewhere in these new suburbs that were arising. So this is a really explicit call to this 20th century history, a really explicit call to suburbs whose legacy is majority white that have made efforts over the course of the 20th century to remain that way. It's a really explicit call to preserve them in that nature and protect them from that urban core, which for so long, for so many decades, has been, predominantly people of color. So that is just a clear part of American history that he's making an explicit call out, invoking that threat.
So the only thing I would shift slightly, I think, Kesu, the history you're providing is incredibly important, and it's exactly right. That is the underlying dynamic. But I want to be careful when we say that Trump is explicitly calling something out. Because if what you mean by that is he's explicitly drawing upon a history of state-sponsored, state-encouraged segregation, then yes. But if what you mean is he's explicitly invoking white dominance, white supremacy, the importance of white segregation, then no, he's not doing that, not explicitly, not expressly. And it's very important for us to keep that in mind, partly analytically and partly as we think about the future of this country. So analytically, when we look at Trump's messages that talk about things like the suburbs or law and order, fully funding the police, illegal immigration, what we find is that levels of agreement, the extent to the proportion of groups that find that message convincing are almost the same across whites, African Americans, and Latinos. And also that there are very high levels of agreement. Majorities of Democrats agree with those messages. Majorities of union households agree with those messages. And the reason they're able to agree is because Trump is using code. He's dog whistling. He's using terms that very much are designed to trigger an unconscious association with racist structures and racist stereotypes, the history you're talking about, but that on their surface do not expressly mention race. And because they don't expressly mention race, it allows people to say, and they're encouraged to say to themselves, this isn't racism, this is common sense. And I think this is important analytically as we understand how race is operating in the post-civil rights context, how people can simultaneously promote racism and yet contend that they are the least racist person in history, right? So how does that work? But I also think it's really important in terms of thinking about where we're going as a society and how we might be able to engage in repair. Because if what we believe is that Trump has expressly called for white dominance and white supremacy, and then turned around and won the support of millions upon millions of Americans, most likely a majority of whites, it's very hard to see how we come back from that. It's very hard to see how we say to ourselves, we will find common cause, we'll build a democracy, we'll join in society with all of these people who responded enthusiastically to an open call for white dominance. And in fact, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that people are both susceptible to racial fears and also hold to anti-racist ideals, the idea, the moral commitment that racism is wrong. And that is important because, yeah, they are being stampeded by racism, but they're also, the vast majority of them, hold anti-racist ideals as well. And so it becomes important for us to say to ourselves, we need to connect with these folks on the basis of their anti-racist ideals while showing them that their racist fears are just that, stereotypes and lies that actually threaten them, right? And just to put a number on this, surveys suggest that the number of people who are Klan members or who identify with Klan or Nazi values range somewhere between 4 and 6% of white Americans. We're not going to make common cause with them. You know, I'm trying to be nice with Russell, so I'm not going to use swear words this early in the forum. That people, right? No common cause with them. Frankly, the numbers of folks who are steeped in a sort of Fox News, we don't like people of color, we hate liberal government, we trust the rich, that's probably around 18% of Americans. Very hard. We're not gonna reach out to them anytime soon, but that still leaves about 60% of Americans who are toggling between being moved sharply by these deeply racist stories, these superficially race neutral but deeply racist stories, and who are also willing to think, to think positively about the role of government in regulating the marketplace, and to see racism as bad, and to support racial justice efforts, right? So we have to see that these calls are intentionally designed to trigger racist fears, but they are not express calls for white racism or white dominance.
So I guess I'm trying to bridge what you two are saying, and maybe I would see it a little differently, Ian, and I want to get you all's response, which is what I take away from your study, which is fascinating in terms of things that seem obviously racist to, I think, all of us in the room. I suspect most of the people that are on this call, that sort of scholars and progressives have one definition of racism, but the sort of mainstream Americans have another much narrower definition, right? And so how do we bridge that gap? And so, I mean, I don't know, Ian, is it that, what Trump is saying isn't explicitly racist, or is it that mainstream Americans don't know what's racist? That sort of their ability to define racism is so impoverished that things that are clearly calling out the worst in us and driving people to vote in a way that is harmful to the country aren't seen as racist, right? And I want to bring in here also the fact that, even as the Republicans have called out identity politics, the Republican National Convention had a lot of Black people, right? And people of color to sort of verify that Trump's not racist. So like, how do we combat this difference in terms of how people define racism, and then the use of people of color as props to sort of verify that Trump's not racist? Because look at the Black people who are on stage.
So this is where I think we as critical race theorists have a really important role to play in distinguishing between different sorts of racism and being careful what we call, and not what we call racism, but distinguishing the sort of racism we're engaged with. So one way we might bridge my comments with Kesu is to say, Trump is expressly engaged in strategic racism. It is strategic racism in that it is designed to trigger racist stereotypes, but also as a matter of strategy, designed to do so in code so that will not come across as bigoted racism to most people, right? To make those sorts of distinctions. Is he being racist? Yes, but in a way that is strategic. And part of the strategy is hiding it, is gaslighting people about it. What sort of racism is he hiding from people? Bigoted racism. How do most people understand racism? As only bigoted racism. They don't see other forms of racism. So once they say to themselves, Donald Trump isn't being a bigot, he isn't using racist swear words, they then too quickly go on to say to themselves, and therefore he's not racist, right? And we want to say back, oh, he is, not in a racist swear word, vitriolic bigot sort of way, but as a strategy.
Cheryl, do you want to?
Well, I guess I'm not sure where I would situate my remarks in response to both Ian and Kesu, but I guess I would say, starting with one of my favorite Malcolm X's quotes, which is, racism is like a Cadillac, they have a new model every year. And so we are talking about sort of different stages, different iterations of racism. But I actually do see Trump as operating in, what has been called white nationalism, which is a new form and expression of white supremacy. I don't see it as dog whistle. I think he's representing a new stage, which is actually playing itself out globally. I mean, part of what he's doing is doing what some of the same politics were that got mobilized around Brexit, some of the stuff that's happening in Europe. This is contiguous with a repackaging of the older forms of white supremacy into a notion about the need to defend white identity from the advancing hordes. And so whether it's France and Le Pen or whether or not it's Trump here, there's a certain kind of continuity around what I see as a resurgence of white supremacists. Now, that's not to say that every statement that he makes doesn't operate in a dog whistle register. But I think one way of describing it is to say that the pre-Trump Republican Party actually functioned in the dog whistle register, I would argue. And now we have Trump sort of, this is the significance of the presence of Bannon. Bannon denounces the Nazis and the KKK. I don't know if you know this, but he says, they're like old, they're stupid. And what he calls himself doing is economic nationalism, right? But the economics that he's talking about and the people that you're talking about preserving are whites. In part, I guess, to say this, Toni Morrison wrote a really beautiful essay after the 2016 election called Mourning for Whiteness. And in it, she talked about the kind of cataclysmic nature of white identity under pressure, meaning the sense that somehow their world is falling apart. Daniel Hosang and Joseph Lowndes called it the shifting terrain of white precarity. So if whiteness promised, and it never has delivered fully on its promise, right? That's one of its great contradictions. But if whiteness promised that there would be some protection from precarity or some protection from sort of falling out of political view, becoming a political nonentity, the changes that have happened at the beginning of the 21st century, starting with 2008, going through the current moment, and the demographic shifts that we've seen have put pressure on that promise. And so Trump is basically trading on that anxiety. He's stoking that anxiety, and he's doing it in multiple registers. He's doing it both explicitly. There's no way to describe what he's doing in terms of lifting up lifting up groups like the Proud Boys. That's not dog whistle. That's explicit. And so what I mean by that is to say that there's a certain kind of way in which he is mobilizing another form of white supremacy that is tailored to the particular moment, which is, to my way of thinking, part of the problem of the crisis of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism had promised, neoliberalism has failed the working class generally, and the white working class has felt completely betrayed by the political elites. So Trump's stepping into that as some kind of insurgence is doing so in a way which is seeking to kind of redeem whiteness, shore it up, make it, all of these promises about making America great again. That's really about shoring up and redeeming whiteness from what is perceived crisis. So I don't want to repudiate or in any way, Ian, your idea that not everybody that is signed on to Trump has signed on 100%. But I do want to say that if we go back to your initial analysis about identity being at the center, right, of a lot of people's politics, it's both a very narrow notion of racism, but it's also a very hard notion of disidentification, right? that's at the core here, because that's the premise around which white identity is built. Otherwise, how do you have a coalition among whites that includes billionaires with people who are barely making it from week to week? What is the commonality of that group other than a perceived fabrication, which is whiteness?
Okay, Sue, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I would just add to what Cheryl was saying that I think this new formation of white nationalism that we see has incorporated and is quite fluent in the kind of coding Ian was talking about that was developed after the civil rights movement to translate white supremacist concerns into supposedly colorblind language, and combined with a new rhetoric about white pride and a kind of pride and marshaling that code to new toxic effect. So I don't really think there's a contradiction between all of these views, but I think that's what we're seeing. And it's precisely the kind of dog whistle elements of that remain. I think that going back to this Lilla quote that you presented us with, the GOP is doing precisely what Mark Lilla is complaining about. They are completely cognizant that they cannot just rely on their supposed white heartland base, but that they have to reach out to different minority groups. And this is why you see this avid effort to recruit Black celebrities, and why you're seeing blocks of different minority groups at Trump rallies, because they're being very actively recruited in order to give doing exactly basically what Lilla is criticizing the Democrats for doing here.
Amna.
Yeah, I wanted to switch gears a little bit to talk about the Democratic Party, because that's part of his target in that article. And I think now, in some sense, even more than 2020, or even more than in 2016, we're living through a moment where the failure of the Democratic Party's politics is clear. Its invocations of race and gender as a fairly shallow diversity and inclusion tactic is not an anti-racist politic, especially not in the way that anti-racist politics are deepening in the country after the summer of protest and amidst the decade of movement activity that we're living through. It is, as Nancy Fraser wrote a few decades ago, a politics of recognition over a politics of redistribution, where the gambit is to push policies that champion the free market economy, that privatize more and more social goods, pour money into policing, jails, prisons, wars, defund the welfare state, and just hope that you can maintain your hold on the electorate by championing a few women and people of color, including in key positions of leadership. And this kind of position of the Democratic Party that, of course, has some important synergies with all of the Republican politics that you were all talking about, is becoming increasingly untenable. And remarkably more, it feels this year. And even right now, amidst the hunger, the environmental devastation, the debt, and the death unfurled by the coronavirus, the spectacles of police violence against Black people and protesters all year, including right now, that the structures of power in this country, including both parties, and what has become the effective infrastructure of governance under neoliberalism, the market economy, prisons, police, and jails, the way that they fortify elite rule is undeniable. Bloomberg News reported today that billionaires have become another $1 trillion richer under Trump's term, and Jeff Bezos alone has almost doubled his wealth during the virus, so $114 billion to $200 billion. And so I think it's clear that this feels like, and it is, an illegitimate kind of charade for working class and poor people across the political spectrum, whether they be white, brown, Black, Native, or Asian. And so I study, as Russell was talking about at the beginning, and think about accounts coming out of today's social movements with the focus on racial justice movements like the Movement for Black Lives or My Gente, or abolitionist organizing across the country. And what I'm seeing is a kind of return to the intersectionality of the Combahee River Collective to think about race, gender, and class in terms of the intersections of racism, patriarchy, and capitalism that shape not just how we talk, but how we live and how we fight, what we fight for, in a way that Kim Crenshaw also wrote about. So race, gender, and class are identities, yes, and the meaning they have in the way that everyone on this panel has written about emerge out of histories of stratification, violence, dispossession, enslavement, land and wage theft, rape, and more, and as well as people's resistance. So what politicians and what today's left social movements and grassroots insurgencies are fighting for is to pay attention to how the material infrastructure of our society fuels violence and inequality against Black and Native people, trans and queer people, immigrants, disabled people, and to build a world where they have what they, kind of the basic human needs, what people need to breathe, to live, to love, and to thrive, and to do what we have to do to pay attention to the lived realities of race, gender, and class, be willing to take some things apart and to build some new infrastructures. And this is, by the way, for example, one reason why I think the Squad is so powerful and what they're doing, right? So Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, and more. And so I think part of what we're seeing as well is just kind of this kind of shift of like, what does it mean to talk about race, gender, and class today? I think is very much in question, not just for the right, but for the liberal to left spectrum.
So I want to come back to Ian, because I think this idea of all politics is identity politics does raise a difficult question, which is how do we create a coalition between whites who are struggling, who are barely getting by or not getting by, and Black and brown folks? Like, how do you bridge that gap if everyone is seeing everything through the lens of identity?
Yeah, that's such an important question, but let me start by saying, understanding what's happening to us actually really helps us conceptualize new forms of coalition politics. And so to sharpen that point, I know, speaking for myself, that for many years, totally decades, I really thought about racism as fundamentally a white over non-white hierarchy. And from that lens, it became almost impossible to think about the circumstances under which there might be significant white support for ending racism. Because a conception of racism as white over non-white hierarchy has as a sort of an unexamined assumption that racism is always going to be to the benefit of whites, and that whites are going to resist, or that more than just a few whites, because there's some whites who will act out of morality against their interests, but most whites will not. And I think that this is one version of Derrick Bell's interest convergence. It's one way of understanding the permanence of racism. It's one way to understand how a lot of the organizing that is taking place even now proceeds on the basis of a deep skepticism about white allies. But I think that we can shift our perspective in understanding what has happened to us in the post-civil rights movement in a way suggested by Amna's comments, to really think about what has happened in terms of race and class and gender, not race alone, and certainly not class alone, but race and class and then gender. And here, I want to introduce the term political whiteness, and I'll come back to it. But essentially what happens is the party of big business sought to go to war against New Deal liberalism with a class agenda of cutting back on activist government that regulated the marketplace, built routes of upward mobility, supported unions, taxed great wealth, progressive taxation. They sought to launch a class war. And they settled initially on racial division as their principal weapon, right? Using dog whistles about states' rights, freedom of association, law and order, pulling the white working class out of the Democratic coalition, out of the New Deal coalition, and over to the party of big business. This is class war through race, and class war through race very quickly morphed into class war through race and then through gender in the form of people like Anita Bryant, right, who really start to talk, who push the idea that challenges to racial hierarchy are also challenges to patriarchy, that a traditional way of living both recognizes white over non-white hierarchy and also supports a hierarchy of a patriarchal relationship in the household that is then connected to homophobia. That is, this is culture war politics, especially around race, especially around gender, and then its cognates. as a form of class war. And I think we can think about this very productively in the context of political whiteness. I'm really focusing here on the race part, but I'm using the term whiteness rather than just focusing on white people. And here I want to push back a little bit against what Cheryl was saying. The white nationalism of this moment is designed to occlude the fact that it is a pushing for continued white dominance. And this is why Steve Bannon condemns the Nazis and describes Breitbart, he was editor-in-chief of Breitbart, as pushing the idea of the alt-right. Even the word white has been stripped away. They're not white supremacists. They don't even claim to be white nationalists. They claim to be the alternative white, or the alternative right, talking about cultural conflict. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because I've been testing these messages to see how well they did. And I recently, just this summer, I tested a message about illegal immigration, taking a hard look at China, fully funding the police, cracking down on protesters, supporting our own people. And I found that 57% of whites agreed with that message. 57% of African Americans also described that message as convincing, and 62% of Latinos said that message was convincing. So if we say to ourselves, Donald Trump is pushing a message of white nationalism that people recognize as white nationalism, what are we doing with the majorities of Latinos and African Americans who are signing on to that message also? Whereas if we pivot and say, this isn't about white nationalism as a building for the dominance of the white category, but rather about whiteness, that allows us to think about how whiteness operates in communities of color too. Because whiteness isn't just the superiority of people who are white, it's a complex of ideas that includes the notion that people who are lighter are better, right? It rests fundamentally on the notion of status hierarchy between you and your neighbors, where that status hierarchy may rest on color, may rest on accent, may rest on whether you came legally or illegally, may rest on your subscription to patriarchal norms, right? It's whiteness that is being mobilized as part of a class war, and whiteness has its own purchase within communities of color. So we have to see that the language that is being used is incredibly challenging because it has a tremendous resonance, not only among whites, but among people of color too. And I'm gonna stop here. I know that Russell, you framed the question in terms of what's the solution. I'll just gesture toward it, but then I'm gonna stop because other people definitely have a lot to say and amazing insights. Once we understand that political whiteness is being harnessed to a class war, then we can come to see how we can talk to people about giving up the supposed advantages of whiteness as a way to make them, as a pragmatic, not just a moral thing to do, but as a pragmatic thing to do to take care of their own families. That is, this is a recasting of interest convergence that says, if racism is a class weapon, then in fact, the 99% do have an interest in proactively fighting racism morally, but also pragmatically. Now, there's much more to say there. I'm just going to stop. Enjoying this conversation.
Great. I want to let Cheryl respond.
If there was anything that I said that suggested I was talking about white people and not whiteness, then let me back up. I was talking about whiteness. I was talking about why it might be that white people are in a coalition around whiteness, but not that there is some conflation in my own thinking between the two. I start from the proposition, though, Ian, that the question is both a strategic one, the one that you're asking, how do we conceptualize this to think about a point of intervention? But I also think it's important to recognize, as I said, the different forms of racism and racial rhetorical devices that are being deployed, which is, I thought, what we were really trying to look at. So when I was invoking Bannon and talking about the alt-right and white nationalism, I was not suggesting that everybody that signs on to Bannon's project necessarily signs on, as I said, to every single element of the argument. But the fundamental part of the argument, and this is, I guess, the point where I would say that I don't think that there's that much distance between what we're saying. The whole idea here to me is to basically going back to Du Bois's idea about the wages of whiteness, and whiteness bearing both a public and a psychological wage, right? So there is both a materiality to it, which in certain circumstances actually does provide an advantage, but more often than not, particularly under the crisis of neoliberalism, which is basically hollowed out social welfare and any forms of real support for the working class, it functions as a psychological wage, meaning the wage, going back to Derrick, is simply this: you're not at the bottom. You may be screwed up, your life may be completely out of whack, you may not have any opportunity in the opportunity that you thought you had, but at least you're not Black. Now, the question of whether or not that actually means anything, and what it means in the context of a world that is increasingly demographically shifting is the point of intervention. I mean, my argument would be that one of the major sort of sleights of hand in all of this is to make white people believe that their oppression is because of their race, not because of their class. Mm-hmm. That has been, I think, the major fundamental project. So I don't have any disagreement about the idea that there is a kind of cynical deployment of identity in this context to basically buttress and solve some of the crises of capitalism that we've seen over the last time. But historically, of course, this is nothing new. This has actually been a pattern that has been repeated over and over again to solve certain kinds of political and economic crises. The final point I guess I would make is this, which is I see whiteness as both the top-down and bottom-up construction, and maybe that's where you and I might differ. I see it as a bottom-up construction in this sense, in the sense that there's a certain degree of acceptance of Trump's racism, even if there's not a kind of direct co-signing of it. So there's a way in which people will say, well, I don't like the way he talks. You know, you hear a lot of these voters being interviewed right now. I wish he wouldn't say those things. I don't agree with him all the way, but I know he's fighting for me. Okay, so how am I to translate that? I translate that as, I see myself, going to your point, I see myself as adhering to sort of basic norms of anti-racism. I wouldn't talk myself that way. I don't co-sign talking that way. But if the trade-off is, I will accept that in order to protect my position, I am willing to do that. So from my vantage point, there is space in that intervention, but it's not so much the space that involves their conception as white. It's the question of whether or not we can get people to conceive of themselves in terms of their class identity over their racial identity. And that has always been a problem. I said it was the final thing, I lied. The other point is to say that, and I alluded to this in a piece that I recently wrote, people are dying from whiteness. White people are dying from whiteness. And I mean that quite literally. Jonathan Metzl's book talks about it in terms of the ways in which certain kinds of conservative policies, regressive policies, have been supported by the white electorate to their own detriment. And he talks about in the book how opposition to the expansion of Obamacare for Medicaid has actually resulted in increased deaths in certain census tracts, et cetera, that he's been looking at. I would push it even further and say that if we look at the COVID-19 crisis since March, there are white people dying from whiteness. Meaning their acceptance of the fabrication of a white coalition has led them to buy into the denialism around COVID such that they are dying, right? It's true that whiteness is not simply a project that embraces white people, right? And the affiliation and the effort to sort of affiliate people of color with this project, again, is not simply in the United States, but is global, right? It's why we have a Latinx guy that's head of the Proud Boys, apparently. It's why we have, if you look at some of these mobs in Europe, they include brown people, right? And that's always been the case as well, by the way. That is to say, there's a lot of incentive for signing up for that team. So anyway,
I want to shift a little bit. I mean, this is all quite fascinating. I want to shift a little bit to thinking more about what's happened among the left and the center this summer after the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And I'm interested in this tension between, so I think you were right, Cheryl, to say that sort of, we hear a lot of these voters say, I don't like the way Trump talks, but I'm still considering him. I could still vote for him. That his attitude, which they probably won't call racism, isn't disqualifying. At the same time, we have this emergence of ideas among mainstream whites that, in the words of a sign in one of my neighbors in my neighborhood in Oakland, white silence is violence. Right, that sort of, that no longer can you be neutral as a white person when it comes to racism. That you're either racist or you're anti-racist. There's no in the middle, there's no kind of distancing and saying, I don't like the way he talks, but I might vote for him. So I think these are different cohorts of white folks and different ideas around racism and whiteness that are evolving. But I want to hear your thoughts in terms of, did we see a substantial shift in the consciousness of white voters in the middle and on the left this summer with the protests, multiracial protests? You know, did we see something that's going to last, or is this something that you think won't ultimately shift the terrain? And anybody, let's see, anyone want to, maybe Kesu, do you want to talk about the uprising and whether you think you've seen change in your work, for example?
Sure. So I think there has been change. I think there's definitely been a change in popular consciousness, and we have seen that with even the possibility of a publication like the 1619 Project of the New York Times and all of the debate that has generated for the last year or so. But I think that change has been a longer time in the making. I think Ian referred to the kind of movement in academic spaces in the 80s, of course, happening in tandem with other social movements in the streets and inspired by all the movements that were going on concurrently and happened before. And I really actually tend to think that those made a difference. And here is why. I mean, these kinds of changes in the academy certainly shaped my own consciousness and many of my peers, but it isn't only that, right? I teach these subjects, and let's just take an example, like the philosopher John Locke. This is something I really like to teach my students. Looking back, he was so important to the founders, you know, writing in the 1680s. The two treatises was published in the 1680s. And he was also an investor in the Royal Africa Company. He was an investor in the Merchant Adventurers to the Bahamas. He was secretary for the Board of Trade, which decided English colonial policy. I mean, he wrote the constitutions of the Carolinas. He had all kinds of material investments in this project. And there have been libraries full of books written about his work. And yet in 300 years, nobody associated his political philosophy with that investment in the colonial project or the slave trade. The first essay making these connections was published in 1993. So I tend to see us dealing with this legacy of erasure that is centuries long. And I actually do believe, and I'm very interested to hear what the rest of the people on this panel have to say about that. I really think that those movements broke something open, and the floodgates are open. And this summer, with the toppling of all of those monuments, you see a real national reckoning that history, those precise histories in the public eye, that is the culmination of that changing consciousness and all the scholarship that it has inspired along the way. And so I think that truth is incredibly threatening to a nation whose legitimacy has always been premised on the erasure of those histories and those truths. And so that's how I contextualize what happened last summer, and everything we're seeing now is sort of the product of a much longer, decades-long kind of bursting open, of knowledge and a changing of discourse and popular consciousness. That's a very hopeful view, but that's the one I have.
Do others hope that a real transformation is underway?
I have to believe it is, and that's why I keep doing this work.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Casey said. I mean, I agree with everything that she put out there. I think one of the remarkable things of living through this decade is precisely seeing something that I had a really hard time appreciating when I read about the civil rights and Black Power movements, but living through this period of movement, I have personally felt the way that kind of, obviously I'm not speaking for everyone, but there's a way in like the liberal to left kind of space, and maybe more broadly in the country, that we have done a kind of collective learning, right? So the fact that, for example, the demands on the streets after Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown were to indict Darren Wilson, and then now 6 years later, we're at defund the police, as the demand on the streets where the protests were much larger than were 6 years ago. And as you said, there were unprecedented multiracial protests that were not one day, they were the course of the summer. And not only did you have a discursive shift, but you had a material infrastructure that movements and young people kind of have built since 2004 and 6. I mean, everything from political education modules to mutual aid networks and bail funds that kind of allow this kind of radicalizing collective consciousness to take place in its direct and daily and kind of, continually intensifying this year, confrontation with an increasingly kind of unsurvivable set of circumstances for most people, whether that's because in the way that Cheryl was talking about, neoliberalism gutted out social welfare, or it's because of the violence of prisons and police, or it's because of the way that regardless of your class position, we are all facing looming environmental disaster, and the frequency of it is just becoming more and more intense. And so even if you think about Occupy, which has often been criticized, for example, for being mostly white, one of the really interesting things when I talk to and people in the movement for Black Lives ecosystem is a lot of the young people in the M4BL ecosystem, at least they said this to me 4 years ago or something, they got radicalized by Occupy. And so there are these kind of connections of when people come into consciousness around what kind of collectives and infrastructure are there to participate in, what is the political discourse. And so part of the reason why we are able to have this conversation about race, gender, and class, why we're kind of talking about, at least more than we were a decade ago, about these intersectionality in the kind of Combahee River Collective style, is precisely because we have kind of this deepening of intersectional structural analysis and movements. Young people are confronting the crises of debt and joblessness as they, even people who are graduating from college and that kind of thing. And so, that doesn't mean, it's all rosy, obviously, conditions are dire, the threat of right nationalism and the environment are very real and create a kind of sense of urgency about now and a sense of a shortening timeline of how much time do we actually even have to fight all of this. And of course, as we see with the federal indictments of activists in Philly this week, the specter of government repression, which is ongoing, is undoubtedly going to intensify in the coming months, whether Trump gets ousted or reelected.
You heard two relatively optimistic views. I want to ask if Cheryl or Ian might try to channel the late Derrick Bell, right? Who argued about the permanence of racism. What would Derrick say?
What would Derrick say, indeed? Well, first of all, I want to second the notion that we have gone through a remarkable period, meaning it may not seem entirely consistent with what I said before, but I do think that the decades-long work, and in particular the work over the last, I would say, decade, that has thought about politics in a much bigger way, and has not allowed a certain kind of electoral politics frame to set the terms and the outer parameters of the imagination. The push for prison abolition, the push for all of these things has allowed for these signs to pop up in the street about defund the police that we could not have imagined 20 years ago. So I want to recognize that while we were talking about white identity and its sort of toxic expressions, we also have actually the emergence of an anti-racist attempt to claim a position in all of this. And that's why I really want to acknowledge that. What I think Derrick would say is to understand these as historical cycles. That is to say that people's movements and people's resistance actually do have the capacity to move things, to move the needle. But we live in a dialectical world. And in that context, there is often resistance and pushback, so that the door never really permanently opens. The door cracks, certain kinds of things move, but the door never really permanently opens. And I think one can see both in the form that Amna is talking about, which is direct forms of repression and disciplining of the movement, the ways in which there is a certain kind of unease and an effort to sort of say, well, we really need to get through this Trump business, right? We need to consolidate, tone it down, try to basically remove this proto-fascist regime, and then we'll need to do a lot of healing, right? I'm all for healing, but there's a way in which that is framed sometimes, which is often used, I think, to suggest to people down. And I don't mean that just in terms of the political parties, which of course engage in this all the time, right? To use the kind of radical energy and then turn around and say, listen, we just want you to vote and we'll take care of the rest. I mean that to say in terms of people's unease around what the alternatives might be, because we're trying to imagine something beyond the horizon of the existing structures. And in that unease, what I see also is a kind of, not just sort of the white nationalist pushback, but the kind of set of questions that rise up and say, well, what do you want us to do, actually? I mean, in other words, the danger is, I think here, that should Trump be defeated, there's a way in which that itself would be attempted to be positioned as the goal, and therefore anti-racist politics need to kind of step to the side and let normal take over again. In other words, the push to go back to normal. Right?
Yes, I think we're on the same page, Cheryl. And I've been thinking lately, in light of the sturdy leads that we're seeing in polls showing that Biden is likely to win, and maybe I should need to let my mind go there, but sort of like, what's next in terms of race? If he wins, will we see another post-racial narrative, right? Like, we killed Trump, we resolved that question, America has overcome white nationalism. what is the risk that the sort of, as we've come together, people on the left have come together for this purpose, that the momentum that we saw this summer dissipates, and if the idea is that like we solve the problem by voting, but the structures stay in place going forward. And so is anyone worried about sort of, that happening next, and sort of a return to post-racialism? Also, I should say, Biden, much of his appeal, of course, has been, I'll take you back to 2008. It'll be another Obama administration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And critical race theorists, were pushing Obama and saying it's not enough to have a Black president. Like, we need policies. And so, Ian, do you have thoughts in terms of what's next if Biden and Harris win?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I want to just kind of emphasize we've made tremendous progress, and credit for the progress that we've made in terms of shifting people's conception of whether white racism is a problem, how to deal with racism, how pervasive it is, how to think about it institutionally, how to think about it historically. A lot of the credit goes to social movements, but a lot of credit also goes to Donald Trump, in the sense that people look at Trump and say, that guy's a racist. And partly what they're getting at is this sort of, he's stoking racial division, but partly what they're doing is they're saying to themselves, he's outside the norm, he's extreme, he's evil, he's a jerk, he's a billionaire buffoon. Let me put on him a label that connotes extreme, outside the norm, immoral, unacceptable, and racist is a good label. And in that sense, I think a lot of the progress we've made is very important, but there's a risk that it's shallow or fragile, and that we will have a hard time building on that momentum. And I think it's in that sense that it's like we can expect to see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be elected by a solid majority on Tuesday. They will be elected by a solid majority. Whether they will be selected by our supposed democratic institutions, the Electoral College, the Supreme Court, federal courts in general, Republican-controlled state governments, we don't know, right? But we can have tremendous confidence that the majority of Americans democratically will seek to shift power to the Democrats. We can have far less confidence. And this is where we are as a country, that we have to worry that our institutions will betray the Democratic majority.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say that we get through January 20th and a Biden-Harris administration is inaugurated. What is likely to happen? I think there's going to be a big shift back towards post-racialism, a sort of a celebratory, racism reared its head and we defeated that dragon, and now can't we just all get along? And part of the impetus of that, I worry, will be from the Biden-Harris administration themselves. I think that what's happened is that Biden has looked at Hillary Clinton's loss and drawn the wrong lesson, drawn the lesson that Mark Lilla urged. She emphasized racial justice too much. He has campaigned essentially by saying, I'm not Trump, I'm stable, I'm a very palatable piece of toasted white bread, and elect me. But he has not stressed racial justice, and I worry that a Biden-Harris administration may say, we won by not stressing racial justice. Let's not talk too much about racial justice in terms of our policies and programs. But then on top of that, or maybe beneath that, more fundamentally, we need to continue to have a conversation that takes seriously white privilege, that takes seriously institutional racism, that takes seriously reparations. And if we do so in the manner that we've historically been doing so, that is, racism is a white problem, white people need to atone, white people are guilty, they need to do this in order to promote justice for communities of color, there's going to be a tremendous amount of resistance to that among whites. And this is where I think that Amna's right to talk about the important differences that we're seeing in social movements now, which are trying to move away from a single axis analysis of the sort of dysfunctional institutions, the dysfunctional politics that threaten us all, and to start thinking about the way in which class has been pursued through race, has been pursued through gender, and not just class. Or one version of class that Amna mentioned really deserves to be highlighted. Class as petrochemical industries continuing to pursue policies that are pushing us over the cliff of climate collapse. And they're doing so not alone by challenging climate science, not alone by extolling the benefits of profits for Exxon or profits for the Koch brothers, but primarily by funding groups like the Tea Party, by funding claims about voter fraud, by funding culture wars, right? And so the more we can say to folks in a new, hopefully Biden-Harris administration, we must deal with race, we must deal with patriarchy, because building bridges across those lines of division are the only way not only to achieve economic populism, not only to achieve Biden care and health care, but also to save the climate. And building bridges across racial lines means dealing with white privilege, engaging in repair, supporting reparations, supporting integration. That is, we need to build a holistic story that the racial policies aren't all out there all by themselves, just something of concern to communities of color, but they actually concern all of us who want a survivable democracy, a fair economy, and a survivable planet.
So I want to ask you all, I think this follows from what Ian just said. What does Biden's selection of Kamala Harris teach us about racial and gender equality? What lessons should we take away? And really, I'm trying to get at this question of whether his selection of Harris signals a sort of transformative perspective on shifting racial and gender inequality, or something more superficial. Cheryl, do you want to take the call?
Well, I think that in many respects, the selection of Kamala Harris represents a response to the recognition of some sort of baseline electoral realities. What is the most consistent and most powerful, in the sense of consistent and turnout, constituency within the Democratic Party? And what has, if we just run it as an empirical question, who is it that does the labor? So we're not just talking about the voting, but who is it that does the labor in terms of voter turnout, in terms of organizing? It's been Black women. And so I think that to some extent, I know, there was advocacy and pressure on Biden to indicate that he was going to pick a Black woman. So to that extent, it's a recognition of what has been a longstanding fact. But I think in terms of what it actually means, I would go back to something I mentioned and what I think actually Ian was elaborating on very powerfully, which is much in the same way that the symbolism of Barack Obama's presidency actually did not translate into a repudiation of colorblindness. In fact, it was conscripted into a post-racial narrative. We run the danger here of a repeat of that same tune, which is Harris herself. She is a complicated figure. She's very smart. She's a very smart politician. And, without going into all of the debate about her positions and backgrounds, she was not a progressive prosecutor by any means. She was certainly not one of the worst. She tried to cut some kind of road in the middle. She did some programs that were intended to promote alternatives to incarceration. She was not a big supporter of the death penalty. But I guess what I'm saying is that she's very much, I think, within the core of a certain kind of democratic politics. She is capable, I think, of hearing and understanding certain kinds of progressive language and arguments in a way that would be difficult for somebody of a different generation. And as a California politician, she's had to do that, right? The politics here demand that you at least be conversant, right, in progressive politics. But I don't think that that is necessarily going to be any safeguard against the kind of snapback that I think we risk seeing here, because I do, like Ian, agree that the wrong lesson has been drawn from Clinton's defeat. As he points out, Clinton actually won. What we had was the ways in which the guardrails on the American democratic system operate to check majority rule. So we are faced with that prospect that maybe we might overcome those guardrails, but still face the problem of people's desire to lower the temperature. You know, there's been a kind of way in which we've all been exhausted, and increasingly so during the election season, and feeling overwhelmed. And the idea that that you would take up fights that would intensify or continue to produce a certain kind of social friction is really not, that's going to be a hard sell. But I don't think we have any choice, right? I think if we don't, I think we would be kidding ourselves to think that at this particular point, there's some kind of way to avoid this conversation. We've talked a lot about the presidential election, but if we just think about what's happening in terms of the elections one step down, at the Senate level, at the governor's races, all of these things are reflective of the ongoing levels at which we are still going to have to carry on these struggles, both in the electoral arena and otherwise. I mean, for example, here in Los Angeles, we have a measure on the ballot that is talking about reallocating a certain percentage of the budget towards alternatives to incarceration and policing. The question would be, even given the sort of general liberal politics, liberal to progressive politics of a city like Los Angeles, what is the viability of that kind of initiative? And more importantly, what does its implementation look like, right? Does this look like another form of reallocation in which certain kinds of institutions and players end up in control of that apparatus in ways that don't actually effectuate change? I can imagine a version of that that actually ends up reproducing some of the very same problems that we're trying to attack. So I don't mean that to say that there's no change possible. I just mean that to say that it's precarious and fragile.
I'm sure you have views in terms of the significance of selecting Harris, especially given her background as a prosecutor, and again, Biden's position on opposing defunding the police. So what do you expect to happen if they're elected? What is the reform agenda going to look like under a Biden-Harris agenda?
Yeah, so I think Biden and Harris already have repeatedly disavowed. I mean, let me start by saying I agree with everything that Cheryl said. So I want to just kind of build on that. They have repeatedly disavowed and condemned the protests and the demands coming from the protests, specifically defund the police, as recently as this week. And so Biden's selection of Harris, in my view, is in some sense, an affirmation of the Democratic Party's kind of diversity politics, and an attempt to kind of thread the needle between saying we care about people of color and we care about racial justice, and we care about policing, jails, and criminalization. And we're not going to kind of shift on our view of either of those things. And we don't see a tension necessarily in being, relatively law and order oriented and believing in racial justice. And I think that fissure that is happening through today's movements, I don't think it's quite being appreciated yet, but I think that fissure, the idea that, to be pro-racial justice, you have to, in some sense, be anti-police prisons and jails. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be abolitionist, but to really grapple with the massive footprint of the carceral infrastructure as being a central engine of racial inequality, and therefore being committed to kind of shrinking it substantially. But that's like the only way to really be, I think there's kind of like growing hold for those kinds of ideas among young people and among social movements. And so I think, the Democratic Party is trying to kind of, like all these issues are playing out as we speak. And so I think it's kind of an attempt, like I said, to kind of thread that needle. And so on the one, and so this is also a place where I would say, like, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are probably, somewhat aligned in the basic sense that to the extent that we start to move towards politics in the progressive left spectrum of redistribution, which is really how I see defund the police and the Green New Deal and a bunch of the other kind of big, bold demands coming out of young people. And because of growing left elected officials, whether it's the squad at the national level or different Democratic Socialists of America candidates at local levels, you kind of see increasing space being taken up by these ideas. I think we're going to see, so this is kind of like push for where and how we spend money. So like a redistributive agenda in a way that I think the Democrats and Republicans will probably largely be aligned against. And so on the one hand, I don't think we can expect much from Biden and Harris apart from Obama-style commissions. My guess is that we will continue to see pushes around training and diversity within police. It's possible, I think the invest divest framework that has come out of the movement for Black Lives has a lot of common sense appeal. And when you talk to people across social settings, I have found just casually that, it's kind of obvious that we need more money for a lot of things. And unless you're very kind of like anti anything public, I think people understand that. And so I think it's possible that we'll see some attempt to shift money towards social services through grant programs. But beyond that, I'm not very hopeful. But what I am hopeful about, and I hear and heed the wisdom of the elders in the room about the persistence of racism and inequality. And yet I feel, we're kind of in a place where I don't think the movements and the radicalization of young people is going away overnight. I think it's here to stay. I think the way that the left and progressives have grown their power through a multimodal strategy in the way that Cheryl was suggesting, the massive growth of different forms of electoral and protest organizations outside the formal bounds of the Democratic Party, outside of formal politics, the growth and radicalization of labor and striking. I think that's all here to stay. That doesn't mean we will win necessarily, but I don't think it's going away quickly.
We've got to say something about electability and gender. So to my mind, the excitement for Harris as VP did not translate to excitement for Harris as the presidential nominee, right? And I think we also saw resistance and a lot of fear around Elizabeth Warren. And it feels like 2016, people drew lessons around gender from Hillary's defeat that hobbled Harris, Warren, Klobuchar, et cetera. And so that work, I feel like, even if one tells a narrative around racial progress by defeating Trump, there's also a huge piece around gender equality that it feels like this election, of course, a woman being elected as vice president is significant. A Black and Asian woman being elected as vice president is significant, but it still feels like she's vice president. And there's a reason why people feel comfortable with her in that position. And of course, the way that Trump is running against Biden is saying he's about to die and Harris is going to take over and she's a radical leftist, right? So I mean, can people say more about the gender piece of this and how, I don't think women really got a fair shot in this primary among Democrats because of what happened to Hillary and the stories that we tell about that. Anybody? Am I the only one that thinks that?
No, I agree with you, Russell. Hillary Clinton was a deeply flawed candidate, but a lot of the things that she took heat for didn't have to do with those flaws. It had to do with some of the things that relate to the continued way, which is, I think I saw a study which tried to position the United States globally in terms of the percentage of people in the elected body that are identify as women, and we're way down the chart somewhere. So despite certain kinds of formal protections in anti-discrimination law, women in this country politically still do not fare well. I mean, particularly if you compare them to Scandinavia or other places in Europe, I mean, there was Margaret Thatcher, for crying out loud, in England. I mean, if England can elect a woman, come on. I mean, understand there were reasons why it was Thatcher, but you get what I'm saying. So I feel like there is a very much a gender dimension. The Democratic primaries were so chaotic to me. It's hard for me to draw a clear kind of analysis of gender through what happened to the candidates individually. But stepping back, one has to say, well, how does this occur? That there were, in fact, for the first time, so many women candidates. And at the end of the day, none of them could get past the threshold. I think that it reflects the intersection of race and gender privilege that meant that so think about Biden's position in the primary, say probably back in December or November. I may have the timing off wrong, Ian. Help me if I do. But I'm trying to remember that period where he was running out of money. He hadn't won anything. He was almost down for the count, and yet he gets resurrected. So the notion that somehow these decisions had to do with electability and viability, and that's all, doesn't really wash. There's a reason why Biden's candidacy, which was, in dire straits, could be resurrected. But people were saying, well, Kamala, you can't win, or Elizabeth, you can't win. And my candidate, Stacey Abrams, you can't get out the gate. It seems to me that the question of viability and electability is still very much gendered and race coded. So,
anyone else want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I would say 100%. I think that what we saw among many primary voters was a sort of I will vote for whoever is most likely to be able to beat Trump. And then they folded into that calculus race and gender and said the person most likely to beat Trump is not going to be a woman, certainly not going to be a person of color, and certainly not a woman of color, right? And we saw that among women. We certainly saw that even within communities of color, there was a sort of a caution there. And I think that to bring that, to connect that to what does 2021 look like? I think that there's going to be a lot of work for us to keep pushing the idea that what is cautious, what is the sorts of policies, the sorts of language, the sorts of priorities that guarantee holding Congress in 2022, that guarantee a second term or a term for Kamala Harris starting in 2024, that those are progressive positions, not centrist positions. And I think there's just going to be so much work to do there. So one of the things that's happening, I want to also bring in this sort of defund the police. One of the things that's happening with defund the police is really important in terms of shifting the boundaries of what's acceptable political discourse and really getting to people to think about, well, what is, how are the police operating as an institution? And why do these people have guns? And why do they have assault rifles? And why do they have tanks? But I also want to say, some of the research I've been doing shows that avoiding language like that, but talking about violence against communities of color in the form of over-policing and also in the form of mass deportation, that talking about that as part of the divide and conquer politics that we're up against, that argument is a winning argument right now. So I want to really push this notion that there is an argument that is politically compelling right now, that is more politically popular in the focus groups and in the surveys that we've run, is more politically popular even than the sort of colorblind economic populism, more persuasive than a sort of a do racial justice for communities of color type framing. And that is, powerful elites are promoting division. Our fates are linked. Our true enemy are these powerful elites stoking division. Because their tactic is to stoke division, our response must be to build bridges. And by building bridges, we take care of all of our communities. And that sort of a message, when applied to criminal justice reform and also to immigration reform, is actually a winning message, even among whites. That message performs better than a racial fear message that calls for fully funding the police or for strengthening or for building a border wall, right? So it's really incumbent on us to push the idea that understanding that our fates are linked across lines of class, of race, of gender, that bold progressive idea is also the idea that is right now most energizing to Democratic constituencies and the safest route to re-election, to holding Congress in 2022 and to re-election or to the election of the first woman president in 2024.
So I want to shift gears because we are unfortunately running out of time. And I want to talk about, and it kind of goes back to the Mark Lillo and the identity politics piece, right? So I want to see if Cheryl could talk about this. Recently, we've seen in September an executive order that is supposedly combating race and sex stereotyping, but is really geared toward banning programs that are around anti-racism, critical race theory. And so Cheryl, I know you wrote an op-ed criticizing this executive order. Can you tell us about, what does it say? What does it do? What are the risks that are at stake here?
Yeah, so there's actually now, I think, 2 executive orders, one that was issued in September and early September, and another one shortly after, which bans all federal agencies from utilizing funds for trainings that utilize or that are grounded in what the order calls anti-American ideas, and that utilize conceptions like white privilege or invoke critical race theory. I think intersectionality is even mentioned in one of them. And the frame is basically utilizing the federal spending power to say, okay, these are programs that the federal government is using federal money for, that these programs and trainings cannot, in fact, promote these so-called anti-American ideas. I have to say, when I first saw critical race theory invoked in these executive orders, I was a little bit surprised because honestly, I didn't know anybody cared. And I'm being a little bit facetious, but I guess what I'm saying is recognizing that in this context, these people wouldn't know critical race theory if it hit them over the head, but nevertheless, it is standing for anti-racist advocacy and anti-racist speech. It is invoking and demonizing, in a way that has been done historically, anti-racist advocacy as anti-American. This is very, very old. This goes back to the time of slavery, when abolitionist works were considered treasonous and you could be punished for having abolitionist literature. So there is a long, and then of course we can think about the civil rights movement, where forms of anti-racist advocacy were demonized as communist and anti-American. So there's an old trope going on here. What's pernicious and quite chilling about it is the effects. So a lot of people, when they first saw this, thought, okay, so this is more Trump crazy talk. This doesn't really necessarily have any traction, and the answer is to vote him out of office. Well, of course, that's true. The answer to a lot of our problems, at least immediately in the short term, would be to vote him out of office. But what's going on here is actually having current and immediate effect. Yesterday, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund announced that it had brought a lawsuit against the Trump administration on behalf of the National Urban League and the National Fair Housing Alliance, I think it is, challenging this executive order because of the effects it is currently having in terms of canceling, causing institutions and companies or agencies rather, to cancel contracts and trainings that have already been booked because of fear of violating this executive order. The executive order has set up a hotline for people to call in and report for suspected violations of the order. And so now what you can see is what you would anticipate. People are now reviewing contracts, and to the extent that they use any of the forbidden words, striking them or telling people you cannot utilize that. There have been, I forget how many hundreds of reports of programs, et cetera, that have been stopped as a result of this executive order. Obviously, if in fact there is a Biden-Harris administration, one of the first orders of business would be to overturn this executive order. But I don't think that the dogs that have been unleashed by this are necessarily going to be so easily cabined. And what I mean by that is, just in the same way that we've been talking about the push for the politics to return to quote unquote normal, to the extent that critical race theory or intersectionality or deep critiques of whiteness and systemic racism push beyond the boundaries of what is considered to be polite kinds of discursive engagement, the risk will be that even if the executive order is overturned, there will be a kind of retreat from the more sharp edge of the kind of anti-racist analysis that frankly has been lifted up from the social movements that Amna has been talking about, and reflected back towards it in the form of these interventions that we've all explained. The kind of work that the 1619 Commission has done, which has also been targeted, for example, by this executive order, has to do with, again, a kind of attempt to police and once again sanitize the history. And we know how much labor and work has gone into even getting the movement this far. So to think about what damage this has done as being completely sealed off by a change in administrations would, I think, be a mistake. That said, I think the other thing that it illustrates quite poignantly and powerfully is the way in which current free speech doctrine actually fails to protect anti-racist speech. And so I'm not a First Amendment lawyer, but I note with great interest the ironic circumstance where certain kinds of racist speech enjoys First Amendment protection under the rubric of academic freedom, under the rubric of, no content-based regulation. But because in this circumstance, this is speech that is in part funded by government funds, somehow this is fair game. And I note, for example, that we're talking about not just private companies that are contracting, but we're talking about universities and colleges that are often part of these federal contracts. So one can think about, again, the sort of inequities and the asymmetry between the doctrinal protections offered for racist speech versus what is offered for anti-racist speech.
I want to bring Kay-Sue back in here. I mean, because I think some of the things that you said earlier suggest, I think Cheryl also gestured at this, that there's a way of understanding the executive order as the right recognizing that something happened in June. Like the racial uprising did shift an interest in anti-racism and critical race theory, and that we're making progress, and that yes, the executive order is a problem and we have to fight it, but maybe if we step back a bit, we can also see that they're responding to a sense of threat that maybe is real.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, to tie a few things, I've been listening with great interest, to tie a few things together. I mean, I think I've long suspected that if the Democrats were to adopt the kind of message Ian recommends, that it would win. And yet I think if we're waiting for the Democrats to do that, we'll be waiting a really long time. So I, like the rest of this panel, I think, don't have really high hopes for a Biden-Harris win on that count, that they will embrace messages such as that, and we can see a kind of reversion to sort of familiar depoliticization. And I also, agree with Amna, as I sort of also said before, that these movements and this kind of rising popular consciousness is just not getting back in the box. You're not going to put this genie back in the box. And so it is an interesting thing to consider what Cheryl is now raising, and kind of as a counterpoint to that, which is that this new effort to target that discourse and that consciousness is also likely emboldened and not going anywhere. A lawsuit like the one she mentioned, I think we'll see what the fate of lawsuits like that is in Trump courts, and that's going to be a part of his long legacy, obviously. And then, I sounded optimistic before, but I also was silent on the Biden-Harris win because I'm not feeling all that optimistic at all. And so I think the reality is, if Biden and Harris don't win, then this is new federal policy. And then you see a kind of response to a change in public consciousness, a change in discourse, which has been so powerful for so many, especially this past summer, but I really do think it has been going on for some time, in a very pronounced way, at least the last 5-6 years, that led to the transformation that made Black Lives Matter a palatable slogan across the board, even by corporations. Obviously, we see interest convergence happening there too, but nonetheless, big changes have happened. And I am very nervous about what happens if under federal policy, a change in all of that movement, it's really very galvanizing, this new consciousness, is met with sheer force, which is a lot of what we did see over the summer. And I think we can expect to see much more of that if this policy continues to be institutionalized and pursued at sort of new scale and with new force.
So
can I respond to that a little bit? And then I actually want to ask, I'm curious about everyone, but including you, Kay-Sue, about this. Like, one thing we haven't talked about yet, thinking about, kind of movements and people organizing outside of formal electoral politics or formal institutions, is the right-wing, different like militia kind of formations. I feel like in the last week on NPR, I've heard multiple segments about groups of armed white men who are preparing for violence on the day of the election and say that they're preparing for civil war because they think that the left is going to be out in the streets. And so on the one hand, I take the Trump memos and like his Patriotic Education Commission to very much be about trying to reestablish the erasure of the history of enslavement and colonialism in the way that, you've all talked about. And yet, like, I think Russell and others were saying, like, I also think, Trump and these right-wing forces being talked about even by liberals who are being forced to kind of like confront this history anew. So both, I guess, on the level of discourse, as well as like, the shape of politics in the country and electoral politics, I'm just curious, like, how are you all thinking about that part of the Trump politics, which is in relation to law enforcement and militarism, but is not law enforcement and military formal?
Great question.
it's so gloomy what I have to say that I'm kind of hesitant to say it. I mean, there's been a long history of cooperation between public law and public forces of coercion, private coercion in this country. Right. I'm working on a project on Tulsa right now, right? I mean, that massacre happened with complete collaboration between public and private forces of violence. You know, going back to contested elections, we have had them before. During the era of Reconstruction, there were contested elections in which private militias were very active, resulting in incidents like the Colfax massacre. This is not new either, and I think we ignore those histories at our peril, frankly. I have a lot of fear about that legacy and its presence here with us now. And at the same time, I've also seen how radicalizing that confrontation between those kinds of militia forces and public law enforcement and a public rising have been over the last year. And so I must say, I'm kind of holding my breath about it because it is not something I want to see come to pass, but I think that we had best be prepared for it. There's no real reason not to include it as a real possibility in the next months. And at the same time, it seems also to me to be on a much larger scale, you know, not discounting at all the loss of life, the loss of opportunity that would follow, a losing proposition, because that scene, especially in today's media sphere where everything's on camera and everybody sees everything, is so profoundly radicalizing, is global. I mean, America's in the world's eye. So I think we have all of those factors coming into play now. And this is something that all parties on all sides should be thinking about.
Sobering thought, but I think you're right that we cannot assume that Trump's base will stand down just because he loses the election. And so, you know, we've worried about the sort of post-racial narrative, but we may not even get there if there's a rebellion that follows a Biden-Harris win. More we could say about that, but I do want to bring in the Supreme Court because we've seen this historic shift where Trump really has taken over the courts, filling the lower courts, installing a rock solid, what seems to be a rock solid conservative majority on the Supreme Court. What's next for Democrats in terms of the courts if Biden-Harris win? What is the strategy going forward? Is there a strategy? Maybe Cheryl or Ian, our con law folks.
Well, I would hope that they would get one because we're here because they didn't have one. I'm not saying that, you know, life would be radical, you know, that the courts would not still be inherently conservative. I think law is an inherently conservative enterprise by way of its structure. It's backward looking, it looks at precedent. But I do think that, you know, Trump gave the Republican Party the tool that was needed to consolidate their takeover of the federal judiciary, which has been a 40-year-old project. For 40 years, you know, and if you go back to any of the sort of founding documents of the people that brought us the Federalist Society, this was the project. And why it has taken the Democratic Party until now to sort of realize this as a crisis is not clear to me, other than I think they thought they were playing a different game. And I also think that this represents the limits of Democratic sort of liberal political imagination. The idea is if you found that center ground, that Democratic Leadership Council ground, you could manage through the maintenance of Democratic majorities that you stitch together. And I guess they forgot the basic civic lesson, right? Which is there's 3 branches, there's this third one. So without my continuing to throw shade, I guess I would just say that at this point, I think what it does trigger is a recognition that the federal courts are going to remain and become even more antithetical to real democratic change. I think that that means that we may have to start looking at state at different levels of trying to implement certain kinds of policies that we might actually want at the national level, but we might actually have to start thinking about moving at a state level, because the federal government, or the federal court system will remain as I say, in opposition to major democratic transformation through Congress. That's not to say that I don't think Congress shouldn't do anything, but what I am saying is that we may have to start to think about our strategy as targeting state by state kind of enactments of certain kinds of policies, where obviously it's more efficient to go federally. But we're going to have to think about strategies of avoiding the federal courts, is what I'm saying. The second point is with regard to the Supreme Court itself. I think we're at a point where it's time for a much overdue conversation about how the court is structured, about the number of members and tenure. There's been discussions about this for a long time. I know Biden doesn't want to touch it right now. He probably is going to remain skittish about saying or doing anything about it. But I think that we do have an opening now to actually say this is why this system is not rational. And this is actually something that there may be, to Ian's point, places where there's people along different sides of the spectrum that might actually see the value of this. If one can think about what the transition points are and how to think about the transition to a new system, which is always the sticky wicket. But if one can think about what are the transitions to, say, 18-year staggered terms, what are the ways in which that looks? I mean, we there's something completely ghoulish about the situation that we currently have, which is, when members of the court are undergoing, various health challenges, there's this kind of hanging, well, are they going to make it or not? Or it's just bad. It's just bad. So there's a lot of ways in which I think this crisis, because I do see it as a crisis, can open up something. The one area where I'm deeply concerned, this is, I don't know what the solution to this is, although I do think maybe, again, thinking about a state-by-state strategy might be appropriate, is the degree to which the Supreme Court has, and certainly signaling now, its really hostility to robust concepts of voting rights. And that is something that I don't know that a state-by-state solution really is going to offer much of protection, although one could make an argument under Federalist principles that you ought to let the state set up its own electoral system within certain kind of boundaries. So if we can think about taking control of state legislatures in such a way to actually expand democratic participation, we may have some options. But frankly, I think looking at certain kinds of questions now, one of the best ways of approaching may be to think about how to keep it out of the Supreme Court.
I'll just tag on one thing. I agree with everything that you said, Cheryl, but I also think it's been frustrating, as a con law professor, as a teacher for years. Ever since I've been a lawyer, the left's game has been, how do we get the swing vote? How do we come up with some rationale, like the diversity rationale, that will be like appealing to Kennedy or O'Connor? And there's this dilution of what we really want and catering to a very sort of centrist view. And now that's over, right? For a moment, people thought Roberts might be the new swing vote. Well, now that's gone, right? And so now we have to think more ambitiously, more imaginatively, and we have to recognize the brokenness of a system. There's the ghoulish problem of us waiting for people to die. There's also the political problem of people like Justice Kennedy arranging their exit with the president and negotiating to have, his former clerks be appointed. So, it's flawed in so many ways, and that's on display finally. And so it's a different conversation now. And we are almost out of time, but I did promise that we'd take some questions and comments. I'm going to try to read a couple One person wrote, how do we deal with radical language being co-opted by mainstream politics, often in the wrong way? Liberals are arguing about what it actually means to abolish the police. People are misunderstanding what critical race theory is, and even intersectionality and identity politics have been misunderstood. How can we make sure that we are keeping control of the narrative?
I can respond briefly to that. And I just want to say one thing about the Supreme Court thing, because I would be remiss if I didn't. So I think the short answer to that is we just have to keep organizing. Of course, they're going to try to co-opt. Of course, they're going to try to dilute the message. That's how the status quo maintains itself. The only way to make persistent gains on abolitionist horizons or a redistributive politic is just to keep organizing. And to try to build the power of, build grassroots power through different means and strategies. And so on that point, on the Supreme Court point, I guess I'll say two things. I think it's been a massive problem for the last several decades that from the liberals to the left, we have focused on courts in the way that Russell just explained. It's been a way to forego mass politics. We focus, kind of advancing our agenda by appealing to elites that are appointed to the federal bench, as opposed to taking the case to the public. And I think the Trump stacking of the courts kind of makes clear and hopefully gives us a wake-up call to go back to mass politics, or for more of us to engage with it. And then the second point is that is why I think it's really important for people who believe in redistributive projects to think about this moment as a way to start to imagine, how do we undermine the court's power? The court has, it's a fundament of elite rule. And so if we believe in mass politics in a way that we don't have time to kind of unpack now in these last 30 seconds, I really think, adding seats to the courts is kind of the least thing that we should be pushing. People have been pushing more ambitious things to kind of dilute the court's power, whether it's to reduce its jurisdiction or up the number of votes that's required for the court to take cases. But the court is way too powerful for any kind of serious mass politics. And I think we really have to think about how to diminish its power in the democracy.
We've had several questions that are along the lines of, why do these issues matter for everyday people? I know, Ian, you in particular with your Race Class Academy, that you are trying to reach regular people. Do you want to speak to that? And if there's time for others as well, sort of, can you boil down what this means for everyday folks?
I think here's the bottom line. What we're talking about is power and how power is exercised in society. And right now we're in a situation where over the last 50 years, power has become increasingly concentrated, so much so that a global pandemic has been allowed to rampage through the United States. 1,000 people died today, the vast majority of whom should not have died. So much so that these powerful elites are pushing us towards climate change, and so towards climate collapse. It couldn't matter more to every one of us how power has organized itself, how power justifies itself, and how we build power among the rest of us. Right? That's the basic frame. Who's exercising power? Where is it driving our society? And now what CRT in this conversation is doing is it's providing tools for organizing for understanding what's happened and a basis for organizing. And so there's, thanks for mentioning Race Class Academy. What I'm really trying to push is this idea that our fates are linked and that we should understand racism, class itself, patriarchy, all of them as partially independent, but also perhaps most importantly, as part of the way that concentrated power shatters social solidarity, makes us fear each other in ways that makes it impossible for us to stand up to concentrated wealth and concentrated power. And so Race Class Academy is raceclassacademy.com is a website where I've put a bunch of short videos explaining these ideas. But that's what we're trying to talk about. We're trying to say, how does power organize itself? How does it use racism and patriarchy, xenophobia, homophobia? And how do we build power among each other to make sure that we can live with dignity in a survivable planet?
Closing thoughts, Cheryl, Amna, Kesu?
Casey, you go ahead.
I mean, I just wanted to say something to the point that was just mentioned about voting rights. And to just say that no matter what the outcome of the election, one thing that we are going to have to contend with is the new appetite and energy for consolidating minority rule through control of federal institutions. That's something that we have seen gain in kind of energy and speed and effectiveness. And even if it doesn't work this time, it's not going away. And if it does work this time, we are in some real trouble. So that's one thing I think that we all need to be thinking about no matter what. To the point about the shift from focus on federal to state courts, as somebody who was in legal aid before starting to teach, I will say that I feel like it's been a long time that a lot of attorneys have been aware that it's state courts that are really handling the matters that affect people's everyday lives. That's where evictions happen. That's where foreclosures happen. That's where all kinds of the cases, you know, municipal courts, that's where the bail cases are heard. So I just, the general obsession with federal courts and kind of the symbolism of the federal courts has been to the detriment of the possibilities for organizing to create real change in the courts that actually affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis, and that really matters. So regardless of what happens, not to be flippant about the loss of federal courts, but it would be a good thing to redirect our attention to those courts no matter what.
Interesting. Cheryl or Amna?
I guess I would just say that I think that we are all well aware of the historic moment at which we're sitting. And none of us, of course, has purchase really on what comes next. But I do think we do know that something, and it's going back to something Amna has said, and I think we're all reflecting it in some ways. What has happened in the last year and I guess I would say in the last decade is significant, cannot be erased, and actually does create conditions of possibility that were not present before. And regardless of what happens, I think that we can take from that, you know, what the people that came before us and the generations came before us, which is to understand that our job is basically to push that as far as we can, regardless of where the limits of that horizon actually turn out to be, that we have now moved. This movement that we have witnessed now did not just happen. It was built on, you know, many, many things, but it also reflects lessons learned. That is to say, we are each in a process of learning and understanding and responding to the changes that we see. And what I see is not just that the genie won't go back in the bottle, but that it's a very different genie, and it's not the same genie that emerged. That there are in fact some fundamental differences in understanding about what it means to have movement leadership. Right? Far different from what they were 30 years ago. There is no longer discussion about, well, I shouldn't say there's no longer discussion about, but the idea that we're looking for another Martin Luther King, or we're looking for some other leader, specific leader to articulate. I don't even hear that anymore in terms of young people who are organizing. That's not even like an aspiration. That's something that some news media person comes up and asks them, well, so who is your leader? And I think that that reflects lessons learned. So I actually am, I guess I would call myself cautiously optimistic. Not so much optimistic because of what the specific outcome of the election will be, but because I think that we have grown.
That's beautifully put. Amna, did you want to have any final word?
I mean, just briefly, just to add on to what Cheryl said, I mean, I think the importance of participating and showing up for this moment of possibility is really, really important, because it's our best antidote to, the best antidote to, you know, both state repression and right-wing organized violence is all of us participating and showing up in numbers in all the different ways that we can today.
Agreed. Thank you all for this vibrant conversation. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Please do vote. Continue to follow the center and our event on November 17th. Thank you all for this beautiful conversation.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much, Russell. And thank
Thanks,
you,
Russell.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.